Hey everyone, I'm Jalen Taylor, the Expo Manager at Pixelpop Festival 2020. I'm so excited to introduce our next session, We Need to Rethink Player Agency, presented by Cyril Focht. Cyril is an independent developer who just graduated with his master's in computational media from UCSC, where his focus was an interactive narrative. The years since he graduated until the pandemic has been spent on the road connecting more deeply with people who had been physically distant in his life and using those experiences to inform his design practice. Let's watch.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cyril Fote, and I have some serious criticisms of the way we often think about player agency with respect to narrative design. But before I get into those criticisms, we need to think about what player agency is, and what even are the views that I'm pushing back against. And to do that, it's going to be instructive to examine some history of the idea with respect to games and how that's informed the way we as designers have continued to think about it. I think it's important to note that while it wasn't widely influential, the first place we see this idea being talked about is in Marianne Buckles' dissertation on adventure games in 1985. But the two works that later brought the idea into conversation, independently of one another, were Janet Murray's book Hamlet on the Holodeck in Scholarly Communities and Doug Church's essay Formal Abstract Design Tools in Design Communities. Murray's concept of agency and Church's intention and perceived consequence are both primarily concerned with the player's desire and ability to take action that is impactful and to see the results of those actions. Something we need to be critical of to understand the impacts their ideas have had is the body of work that was informing these ideas. There were a lot of areas Murray made insights into, but I think she was primarily focused on cyberdrama, looking to the holodeck, namesake of the book, as an end goal of digital narrative. And Church was working on immersive sims at Looking Glass, which are a pretty specific form of game narrative. Like the ideas they introduced, the narrative frameworks they were looking at were also remarkably similar to one another. The term has since evolved quite a bit in academic literature, but I think its usage amongst designers hasn't really changed all that much. So the premise my arguments are grounded on here is that the way we talk about agency as designers is usually reduced to being a design goal in which the player is afforded a wide array of ways they're able to influence the game world. And that's fine, but if it's the only approach that gets used, it can be really limiting to the kinds of stories we're able to tell. This is the hero's journey of video games. The problem is not that it is a bad approach. The problem is that we use it so much there isn't room left for other approaches. And I invoke this analogy not just to make a joke, but because I think they've evolved from similar sort of storytelling traditions, where the world exists so we can see what the hero does. And this does have its place. I've been listening to the Hadestown soundtrack on repeat for 2 months now and have done a lot of crying while listening to it. As a modern retelling of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, the show definitely engages with the Greek approach of having a protagonist whose role is to demonstrate some aspect of virtue to the audience. Orpheus in this show has a lot of qualities that I try to emulate, but ultimately, because of the framework they're using, all the other characters pretty much just rely on Orpheus to solve all their problems. And I want to contrast this with The Good Place. Both of them have been hitting a lot of the same buttons for me lately in terms of their themes, doing what we can to make things better for people in the face of hopelessness. The key difference that I want to point out in what they have to say about this theme comes from their narrative frameworks. Where Hadestown has a single protagonist, The Good Place has an ensemble cast, so has a lot more to say about the role of community in trying to make things better. That's probably the most important aspect of the show to me, and I don't think they could have had the same messages in a single protagonist format. Now, returning to games, how can we update our understanding of agency a little bit to make room for different storytelling frameworks? The perspective of agency that usually grounds my own approach to it comes from Wardrop Fruin et al.'s 2009 paper, Agency Reconsidered, where they proposed that rather than having the ability to affect the world however the player might desire, a sense of agency arises when the fiction and systems of a game suggest certain actions to the player, which are then afforded by the game's systems. So the fact that players are unable to plant flowers in Doom has no bearing on the player's agency because there is nothing in the game that suggests the action of planting flowers to the player. And this is also how a lot of horror games work. They instill fear by means of powerlessness by emphasizing through the game's systems all the ways the player might want to influence a situation, yet completely lacks the ability to do so. This reframing gives us tools for thinking about how varying approaches to agency are meaningful. What does the game want us to want? How does it respond to us trying to fulfill those wants? And how is the relationship between the two meaningful? Because agency is so directly wrapped up in power dynamics, by limiting our conception of agency, we limit the stories we tell to being about the characters that have power, about how they exert that power, and about having power. By shifting how we think about player agency, we consequently shift how we think about power structures in narrative, and as a result, can say different things through our work that don't come across as strongly when the work is centered on one character having power. Hannah Nicklin talked about this some in her GDC talk earlier this year, Kill the Hero, Save the World. She went over her approach to ensemble storytelling in Mutazione, and most of that approach revolved around how agency was used to decenter Kai, the protagonist, and put more emphasis on the complex, vibrant community around her. Meg Gianth gave a 2016 GDC talk, Forget Protagonists, about how the anti-colonial themes in 80 Days were grounded in the way player agency was deliberately limited. And CC Jiang basically spent an hour ranting in a Narrowscope talk a few months ago, More Choice is Not Better, about how formats like visual novels are often looked down on for their approaches to agency, when the approaches they do use better serve the stories they're telling. Now, I can't actually give a lot of insight into what stories we're missing or what other approaches we can take to telling new stories, because frankly, there's a lot of space there, and I just don't know what most of it looks like. So instead, I'm going to focus in on one aspect by showing how different approaches to agency affect how we think about character, and show how that's informed the approach I've taken to writing characters in my own work. Since the main narrative mechanic in a lot of story games is making choices on behalf of the focal character, there tend to be different variations of that character that emerge amongst playthroughs, and we can think of these variations as existing within a sort of character space. Within this space, there are core aspects of a character that are consistent across any of the various ways a story can be enacted, that we can read as sort of immutable characteristics. I refer to this part very academically as the character nugget. And there's also a space of characteristics that aren't necessarily consistent when the story is enacted differently. This area of more mutable characteristics is what I'll be referring to as the character cloud. Whenever the player makes a choice of the character's action, that choice is occurring somewhere within this character space, since character is defined by the actions they take. Depending on the situation, the two outcomes might conflict in a way that communicates two different characters. But they also could be close enough in that cloud to convey the same character. Of course, there's nothing clear-cut here. The reason I refer to it as a cloud is because it's super nebulous, and there really is no way to definitively distinguish any of it. The big point, though, that I want to make here is that character space gets shaped differently when we think about agency in different ways. we can contrast things like early CRPGs like Fallout or Planescape, where the designed intent was to have as much space in that cloud as possible, and the nugget is usually just the quality of being the protagonist, to immersive sims like Deus Ex or Bioshock, where there's more characterization in the nugget, but still a lot of room for very different versions of that character, to adventure games, especially Renaissance adventure games of the last decade like Kentucky Route Zero or Firewatch, where there are really only subtle variations of the character that come across in different player choices. If we look, for example, at the scene in Firewatch where Henry confronts some teenagers setting off illegal fireworks, the dialogue options are all pretty similar to one another in how they characterize Henry. But the Henry that says, "Hey, can you maybe not shoot fireworks, please?" still reads to me as a different character than the one who threatens them and then throws their stereo in the lake. But those differences are still a lot closer to one another in terms of how they communicate Henry's character than, say, Corvo in Dishonored, either trying to not kill a single person or going on a vengeful rampage killing every person he can. There's a problem we run up against when we have the player making choices on behalf of a character, or otherwise deciding how the character manifests within that character space. And it's the question of what kind of agency that character has when the player is the one making the choices. Are their desires being expressed through the player's afforded options, such that those options are characterizing in themselves? Or, going back to that thing about power dynamics, does the player impose their will upon a character by dictating the ways they respond to a given situation? Returning to Firewatch, there's a prologue at the beginning that consists of a series of binary choices. Henry falls in love and navigates a relationship. Do you choose thing A that Henry wants or thing B that Julia wants? But the choices in the prologue culminate with this choice, where Henry is unwilling to do thing B. We get two versions of thing A. There is no will external to Henry's that comes through in this choice. Sure, the player gets to choose between one of the two, but by signposting another option that the player cannot choose, this choice does a lot of heavy lifting to establish Henry's character by limiting the player's agency in this situation. So in effect, what we get is, rather than a choice being made in the cloud, both of the options here are in the nugget. And I think that's a lot more powerful in terms of communicating character to the player. And that brings us to the piece I'm working on. Sonder is a game about a day in people's lives, and is totally available to play on my itch page, just saying. I really wanted to write something that examines characters as complex individuals through their everyday lives. So to write that as an interactive piece, I decided to write the choices so they say as much as possible about the character through their multiplicity. I thought it would be important to the piece to lean in as much as I could to writing the characters so that the cloud is as small as possible and the choices occur within the nugget space. Chris's story, the character on the right there, opens with a scene where he sees a homeless man being verbally abused in the subway, and he decides whether or not to sit and chat with the guy. The fact that he's considering these two options doesn't really say much on its own, but because of the way options are selected, by clicking the highlighted text to cycle through options, it shows us that taking the time to sit with the guy is his first instinct, and that even if he decides not to, there is not an instance where he does not first consider it. Most of the choices in the game come as dialogue options, but not as choosing what to say next. When another character's dialogue is displayed, some of the words are highlighted, and if you mouse over the text, it reveals the focal character's thoughts, in this case Chris's, and the player can choose which piece of text to click on. But those thoughts aren't necessarily indicative of the following response. So the player really only decides which of the conversation threads to follow, rather than directing what's said in the conversation. There's a conversation Chris has with his mom on the phone, some of which is pictured on the slide, where she asks a barrage of questions about how his life is going in college, and he responds by resisting the conversation. We can see him thinking to himself that things aren't really going so hot, but he responds by saying, "Things are fine, Mom. Don't worry about it." And the way he contradicts himself here, in a way that he doesn't in most of the other conversations we see, reveals more through the affordances of the choice about the strained relationship with his parents that we don't get from just the dialogue. More than expressing character, though, I'm really trying to push the idea that you don't play as the character, and the player does not control what the character does. I'm designing the interactions to act more as a lens into the character's headspace. And I'm designing it to have a strong aesthetic boundary between the player and character, so even if that's not recognizable to the player, it's going to have a lot of influence on how I'm writing the whole game. So, in conclusion, we think about agency with more complexity, we get more mileage out of our writing. Thanks for listening.
Stay tuned for our feature games coming up next. Flux with a live Q&A and cold calling.